The North Sea, November 1943. A German minesweeping flotilla moves in careful formation through gray water, roughly 40 nautical miles off the Dutch coast. The vessels work in pairs, their paravane cables stretched between them like a trawler's net, designed to snag the mooring lines of conventional mines and drag them to the surface where gunners can detonate them at safe distance. It is painstaking, dangerous work, but the crews are experienced, and the method is proven. They have swept this corridor before. They know exactly what the British lay here. They believe they know exactly what they are doing. For the first hour, they find nothing. The cables trail, the ships move in their practiced arcs, and the sea offers no resistance. The flotilla commander, standing on his bridge in the damp November air, marks the corridor as clear on his chart. Then the first ship disappears. Not hits a mine. Disappears. The explosion originates not at the hull's edge but beneath the keel, a column of water punching upward with enough force to break the vessel's back amidships. Before the crew of the second ship can process what they have witnessed, they too are gone. The third vessel, turning to render assistance, triggers something in the water that has been waiting with genuine patience, waiting not merely for a ship to pass overhead, but for a specific combination of sounds, pressures, and vibrations that match a preset profile with clinical precision. It has been waiting, in fact, for a minesweeper to return after having already swept the area once and decided it was safe. The water closes over the wreckage in minutes. In the gray November light, it is as though the three vessels simply ceased to exist. This was not a conventional mine. It was not, in the truest sense, even a weapon that the men who created it were entirely comfortable with. What had just killed those crews was the product of a small, secretive department within the British Admiralty's mining division, a device so deliberately unsettling in its operating principle that the engineers who designed it reportedly debated whether it crossed a line that even wartime ethics struggled to define. It was classified at a level that meant even senior naval officers were denied access to its full specifications. When the war ended, those specifications were not merely filed away. They were, for purposes that the official record describes only as operational security and ethical review, placed in a category so restricted that historians spent decades not knowing precisely what they were looking for. This is the story of what they eventually found. By the spring of 1940, the British had a mining problem that was, at its core, a problem of futility. The Royal Navy's standard moored contact mine, essentially a spherical steel shell packed with explosive and anchored to the seabed by a cable, was a First World War technology deployed in a Second World War theater. It worked exactly as designed. A ship struck the horn-studded sphere, crushed a glass vial of electrolytic fluid, completed a circuit, and the mine detonated. The Germans knew precisely how it worked. They had been sweeping British mines since September 1939 with an efficiency that bordered on contemptuous. The German minesweeping fleet was, by any serious assessment, the finest in the world. Their M-class minesweepers, purpose-built vessels displacing roughly 750 tons and capable of 18 knots, operated in flotillas that could clear a 600-meter-wide corridor of conventional moored mines at a rate that rendered the entire British mining campaign in the Heligoland Bight statistically pointless. Between October 1939 and March 1940, Royal Navy analysis suggested that German sweepers were achieving clearance rates above 80% within 48 hours of a British field being laid. The mines were costing British lives to deploy and costing Germany almost nothing to neutralize. The magnetic mine had offered a brief period of genuine terror, aircraft and submarines deploying weapons that detonated in response to the magnetic signature of a steel hull passing overhead, without needing direct contact. But the Germans, displaying their characteristic engineering competence, had responded within months with degaussing systems that drastically reduced ships' magnetic signatures and with minesweepers carrying large electrical cables that could trigger magnetic fuse at safe distance. By 1942, the magnetic mine was a nuisance rather than a strategic weapon. Acoustic mines presented similar difficulties. Early models detonated in response to the sound of a ship's propellers and machinery, the low-frequency thrumming that a large vessel produces as it moves through water. Effective in principle, these weapons were defeated by sweeps that mimicked the acoustic signature, a noisemaker towed by a small vessel at low speed, triggering the mine harmlessly before any valuable target entered the field. The Germans were sweeping acoustic mines within weeks of their first appearance. The problem, reduced to its essentials, was this: any mine that responded to a single, mimicable stimulus could be swept. A noisemaker defeated acoustic fuses. A degaussed cable defeated magnetic fuses. A physical paravane defeated moored contact mines. The British needed a weapon that responded to something the Germans could not fake, could not neutralize, and, crucially, could not even be certain they had failed to neutralize. They needed a mine that could make a swept channel unsafe. What they needed, as one Admiralty document from late 1941 puts it in language that now reads as almost deliberately clinical, was a weapon capable of exploiting the psychological consequences of asymmetric information. The facility at Vernon, HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo and mining establishment at Portsmouth, had been working on compound fuse systems since 1940. The core concept was not entirely new. A mine that required multiple simultaneous stimuli before it would fire would be exponentially harder to sweep, since the sweeper would need to reproduce every element of the trigger profile at exactly the right levels simultaneously. A mine needing both acoustic and magnetic stimulation was harder to defeat than one needing either alone. This was understood. What the Vernon team developed between 1942 and late 1943 went considerably further, and it did so by incorporating an element that was, in the words of one post-war account, not a physical measurement, but a logical one. The device designated internally as the Type 5 exploiter, known informally within the development team as Capricious, a name that was both darkly playful and technically precise, did not simply measure multiple stimuli. It counted them. And it waited. The fuse assembly sat within a ground mine casing, a weapon laid on the seabed rather than moored at depth, making paravane sweeping irrelevant from the outset. The acoustic sensor was a hydrophone of established design, sensitive to low-frequency sound in a specific band matching the engine signatures of vessels displacing more than roughly 200 tons. The pressure sensor measured the hydrodynamic pressure wave generated by a vessel's hull passing overhead at speed, the same principle used in earlier influence mines, but here refined to distinguish between a warship at operational speed and a slow-moving minesweeper. These two systems were not, by themselves, remarkable. What made the Capricious fuse disturbing was the third element, a mechanical counter, robust and simple, linked to both sensors. The mine would not fire on first detection of a valid target signature, nor on the second. It would register each valid passage, each instance where a ship of sufficient size moved overhead at sufficient speed, and decrement a preset counter. The counter could be set, at the time of laying, to any value between 1 and 30. A mine set to a counter of 1 behaved like a conventional influence mine. It fired on first valid detection. A mine set to a counter of 15 would register the passage of 14 ships, destroyers, merchantmen, minesweepers working their careful corridors, and do nothing. On the 15th, it fired. The implications, when stated plainly, are what drove the ethical discussions that delayed the weapon's deployment by nearly 8 months. A channel could be swept, it could be declared clear, ships could transit it with measured safety, and then, weeks or months later, without any new weapons being laid, it could kill again. The mine was not merely dangerous. It was specifically, deliberately engineered to destroy confidence in the safety of waters that had already been judged safe. The manufacturing process involved components from several dispersed sources to limit the damage of any single bombing raid on production, The fuse mechanisms were assembled at a facility in the Midlands, whose precise location remains partly redacted in surviving documents. The mine casings were produced at a Royal Ordnance factory in Scotland, and final assembly was carried out at Vernon itself. Surviving production records suggest that approximately 460 capricious fuse mines were completed between October 1943 and April 1944, though this figure is accompanied in the documents by a caveat noting that certain production runs were classified at a level above the record keeper's clearance. The mine casing was cylindrical, roughly 1.5 meters in length and 60 centimeters in diameter, weighing approximately 900 kilograms fully assembled. The explosive charge, a mix of TNT and aluminium powder known as Torpex, standard for British ground mines of the period, weighed approximately 500 kilograms, sufficient to break the keel of any vessel up to and including a light cruiser. The counter mechanism itself was, by contrast, almost elegantly simple. A gear train driven by the sensor outputs, advancing a wheel with ratchet tooth precision, each valid detection moving the count by exactly 1. The final tooth in the wheel completed the firing circuit. A watchmaker might have recognized the mechanism without knowing its purpose. Its purpose would have disturbed him considerably. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operational deployment began in late November 1943, with the first fields laid by aircraft of RAF Bomber Command's 5 Group, operating Avro Lancasters in the mine-laying role they undertook with greater regularity than most histories acknowledge. The North Sea approaches to German-controlled Dutch and German ports received the initial allocation. Later fields were laid in the Kattegat, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden, through which a significant portion of German iron ore shipping moved, or that fed the steel production that built the tanks and guns and ships that the war required. The documented operational record for the capricious mines is thin, and deliberately so. The weapon's effectiveness depended absolutely on German ignorance of its operating principle, which meant that even after losses that could be attributed to its use, maintaining official silence about the mechanism was considered a higher priority than claiming the tactical credit. What survives in the Naval Intelligence Assessments of 1944 and early 1945 is a series of unexplained losses in channels that had been recently swept and certified as clear. One assessment from February 1944, declassified in the 1970s but rarely cited, notes a pattern of detonations in corridors where sweeping operations had been completed within the preceding 14 days, and observes that German minesweeping flotillas appeared to be increasing the number of sweep passes per corridor, suggesting awareness of an anomalous mine type, though without apparent understanding of the operating principle. German minesweeping doctrine, by mid-1944, had reportedly shifted to requiring 3 separate sweep passages before declaring a channel clear. This tripled the time and resource cost of maintaining navigable routes, which was, in its own right, a significant strategic effect. The psychological dimension was, by most accounts, as significant as the physical. Merchant mariners and naval crews operating in the North Sea and Kattegat during this period wrote in their personal accounts of a specific variety of dread that differed qualitatively from the ordinary fear of mines, not the fear of a known hazard, but the fear of a hazard one had been assured no longer existed. Survivors' testimonies collected after the war describe captains who had crossed a swept channel safely 3 or 4 times, becoming unwilling to make the transit again, not because of any new intelligence, but because their confidence in the sweep's validity had eroded to nothing. Exact losses attributable specifically to capricious fuse mines are, at present, not definitively established. German wartime records were partly destroyed in the final months of the war, and the classification applied to the weapon's mechanism meant that British records connecting specific losses to the specific weapon were filed at a level that even the post-war historical branches did not fully access until the 1990s. The Germans were not, it should be said, without their own sophisticated mine technologies. The Luftwaffe's LMB magnetic mine, dropped by parachute into harbor approaches and shipping lanes, had caused genuine crisis in the early months of the war, sinking merchant vessels in the Thames estuary and temporarily closing British East Coast ports. The German SDM ground mine combined acoustic and magnetic fuses from 1942 onwards, representing a reasonably competent compound influence weapon by the standards of the period. What the Germans never achieved, as far as post-war analysis of captured German mining research can establish, was a reliable counting fuse of the type at the heart of the capricious design. German influence mine fuse of the period incorporated ship counters in a rudimentary sense, mechanisms that prevented the mine from firing on the very first detection, to prevent triggering by the minesweeper rather than the operational target. Typically, these counters were set to values between 1 and 3. The concept of a counter set to values as high as 20 or 30, with the deliberate strategic intention of validating a swept channel before it became lethal, appears to have been beyond the scope of German naval mining doctrine. The American contribution to Allied mining during this period is worth noting by way of comparison. The United States Navy's influence mine program produced effective weapons, most notably the Mark X destructor series deployed in the Pacific Theater from 1944 onwards. American mines of this period incorporated magnetic fuses and, in later variants, acoustic sensors, but the compound multi-stimulus approach of the British capricious design was not replicated. American mining doctrine in the Pacific relied more heavily on sheer volume. The Operation Starvation campaign of 1945, in which B-29s laid over 12,000 mines in Japanese home waters in a matter of months, achieved its effects through density rather than technical sophistication. The British and American approaches to the mine warfare problem were, in this sense, the product of different strategic cultures. The Americans had industrial capacity to substitute for complexity. The British, facing resource constraints and an established German minesweeping capability, needed weapons that could defeat the sweepers rather than simply outnumber them. The Japanese had no equivalent to capricious. Their mine warfare capability, while effective in coastal defense roles, lacked the sensor sophistication to produce comparable compound fuse systems. The Soviets, who received some intelligence on British mining technology through liaison channels, reportedly attempted to develop counting fuse mechanisms after the war, though whether this derived from knowledge of the capricious design specifically or represented independent development is not established. Assessing the capricious mine's actual contribution to the Allied war effort requires care, because the weapon was one element in a mining campaign that was itself one element in a wider naval and air strategy. And because the specific classification applied to it means that any figure for ships sunk must be treated as a minimum rather than a definitive count. What can be said with confidence is this. In the operational areas where capricious fuse mines were deployed, German minesweeping costs increased substantially. The requirement for multiple sweep passes before channel clearance, the extended time between sweeping and the resumption of commercial traffic, and the redirection of minesweeping resources from offensive to defensive tasks, these were measurable effects, documented in German naval records captured after the war. The mining of the Kattegat, where iron ore shipping was a strategic priority, contributed to a reduction in ore tonnage reaching German ports during 1944 that historians of the German war economy have documented as a meaningful constraint on steel production. The psychological effect is harder to quantify but may have been equally significant. The erosion of confidence in swept channels, the introduction of genuine uncertainty into a system that had previously operated on the assumption that a swept channel was a safe one, altered German naval behavior in ways that had compounding strategic consequences. Ships that move more slowly, take longer routes, or delay departure are ships delivering fewer supplies. Fear of mines in channels that had been swept was not irrational. It was, in the most direct sense, exactly what the weapon had been designed to produce. Several examples of British ground mine casings from this period survive in naval museums. most notably at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport and in the collections at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. Whether any of these casings contain or contained capricious-type fuse assemblies is not confirmed in the public record. The fuse mechanisms themselves, the counting gear trains, the compound sensor arrays, are not on public display anywhere, as far as the available literature indicates. The ethical questions that delayed the weapon's deployment were never formally resolved. They were, in the manner of wartime, overtaken by events. Return, for a moment, to that November morning in the North Sea. The three minesweepers doing exactly what minesweepers do: methodical, professional, working from a doctrine that had kept them alive and effective for 4 years of war. The mine that killed them was not waiting for a ship. It was waiting for the 14th ship, or perhaps the 19th. The men who laid it had set the counters and then, in the parlance of the operational record, moved on to the next task. Somewhere in the Admiralty files, in the specific section that was not open to historians until 1997, and even then only partially, there is a notation for each field laid: the coordinates, the date, the quantity of weapons deployed, and the detail that transforms a tactical record into something more uncomfortable: the counter settings. What the capricious mine represents, stripped of its technical vocabulary, is the weaponization of confidence itself. Not the destruction of shipping, though it destroyed shipping. Not the denial of sea lanes, though it denied them. Its primary effect, the one its designers had most carefully engineered, was the destruction of the certainty that a safe place was safe. Every technology of war represents choices made by people under pressure. The men at Vernon who designed the counting fuse were not monsters. They were engineers responding to a specific, documented, pressing need, a mining program being negated almost in real time by an expert adversary. The choice they made, to build a mine that waited, that let the sweepers pass and declared a channel clear and then fired anyway, was a choice made in full awareness of what it meant. That is, perhaps, what makes it disquieting across the distance of 80 years. Not the mechanism, the awareness. The 460 weapons that left the Vernon Assembly Facility represented perhaps 10% of British mine production in the relevant period. They were never publicly acknowledged. They were never included in the official histories of British mine warfare, published in the late 1940s and 1950s. When German naval historians began reconstructing the losses of the North Sea and Kattegat campaigns in the 1960s and 1970s, the anomalous sinkings in recently swept corridors were noted as puzzles without explanations. The British held the explanation and said nothing. It is worth sitting with that silence for a moment. Not as a condemnation. The strategic calculation was defensible, perhaps even correct. But as an observation about how wars are actually fought, as distinct from how they are recorded and remembered. The version of British mine warfare that passed into popular history was the version of contact mines and magnetic fuses and brave men laying weapons from aircraft at low altitude in the dark. It was true. It was also incomplete. Somewhere on the bed of the North Sea and the Kattegat, assuming they were not post-war swept by the extensive clearance operations of 1945 and 1946, there may still be ground mines whose counters have not yet reached zero. The shipping lanes they once threatened are now thoroughly charted, and the mines would long ago have become inert. The explosive composition of Torpex degrades substantially over decades, and the fuse mechanisms, precision instruments in steel casings, would have corroded past any functionality within years of the war's end. But the logic they embodied, that a cleared path might not be a safe one, that patience is a kind of weapon, that the most effective fear is the fear of something you were already told was gone, that logic was not buried with them. It was, in the quietest possible way, noted down, filed under a classification marking that persisted for 50 years and passed on.